and welcome to the Veterans History Project. My name is Carl Cox, and we are here with a voluntary resource management service of the VA San Diego Healthcare System at the VA Medical Center in San Diego, California. I am a volunteer at this facility. I am the producer, and I will be the cameraman and your host conducting today's interview. Today's date is December the 7th, 2005, and today's guest is a veteran of World War II. Please welcome Norman Achen. Please state your full name.
Norman Wesley Achen.
Please state your date of birth.
July 11th, 1921.
Please state your current address.
2842 Lucernaga, Carlsbad, California.
Which war did you serve in?
World War II.
Which branch of the military did you serve in?
United States Army Air Force.
What was the highest rank that you achieved?
First lieutenant.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
Where were you living at that time?
Tucson, Arizona.
Tell me, why did you decide to enlist in the Army Air Corps?
Mainly because Uncle Sam's finger was pointing at me every place I went. I was already a pilot and had a private pilot's license. And I wanted to be in the service. I wanted to be a fighter pilot.
Do you remember your boot camp training experience?
Very well.
Can you tell me about it?
Well, at boot camp or Santa Ana Air Base was a huge base of bringing cadets into training. And it was not only flyers, but those that would be bombardiers, navigators, and so forth. I went in by myself to the gate on the date of that I was supposed to report for duty. And a cadet group in Santa Ana Air Base was 240 men, cadets. There had been a troop train come in from Texas with 240 Texans on it. And one guy got sick and they took him off and put him in a hospital. And they said, "You're lucky you're going to be with the 239 Texans." Most of the Texans and most of us, this was the end of the Depression, and Texans particularly and still are very proud of their state and very, very vocal about it. And they think the rest of us are inferior. And maybe they're right. And so they rode me mercilessly for maybe 6 weeks, and I had the first bunk in an upper floor of one of the barracks. And so one night, about 20 minutes before lights out, I lost control, in which I shouldn't have done, but I didn't. I got up and I said, "Okay, you SOBs, one at a time." Down in about the 8th bunk was a guy by the name of Johnny Godbolt, and Johnny was very quiet, didn't say much. I had been told he was an All-American N from Texas A&M. Johnny stood about 6'1" and probably weighed in at close to 210. And he slowly uncorked from his bunk and started up the aisle. And I thought, oh boy, you've made a major, major mistake. The war may end for you. He came up and spun around next to me and put his hand out and he said, "No, 2 at a time." And nobody moved. And Johnny said goodnight and walked back to his bunk and laid down. About 2 weeks, the harassment quit, but they just didn't say anything. And about 2 weeks later, a bunch of them cornered me again, 7 or 8, and said, "Can we talk to you?" And I said, "Certainly." And I looked around for Johnny, but he wasn't there. And they said they had had a vote, and the 239 voted that I become a Texan. And they presented me with a Texas citizenship. And life changed totally, very quickly. That was my greatest experience. And I flew with Texans then a lot during the war. And I admire them very much. That they probably are the greatest fighters overall that you ever see. So that was a tremendous experience. Boot camp was kind of tough, and at times as one Christmas, we weren't allowed out at Christmas because we were still in kind of like a confinement type thing. But the Army did put on a pretty good day for us, entertainment and food and so forth. The other thing that you learn at boot camp, you get healthy, very healthy. But the other thing that you learn is that every Sunday at 4 in the afternoon, they would have a parade, and you would be reviewed in front of a general or something. And the big bands would play, and you became very proud that you were there. And that was boot camp. We were in boot camp for, about 12 weeks, and lots of shots, typical, exercise and marching and learning to take orders and all of those things that you do in boot camp.
Where did you go after boot camp?
I went directly from boot camp to Ryan Field, which is new outside of Tucson, Arizona, about 15 miles.
What did you do at Ryan Field?
Ryan Field was a primary training base, primary aircraft. Flew the Ryan single-engine airplane, and had lots of ground study and flying study. Two interesting things that happened to me and that were interesting at Ryan Field. One of the things was that we had to run around the airfield 3 or 4 times a week, and this would be usually in the afternoon. And this is in the high desert, and this was in June of the summertime of 1942. And Johnny Godbolt dropped dead on one of the runs around the field. And that was the first disaster of the war for me, type thing, because we'd become friends, and he was quite a guy. Within 2 days of that, and it was accidental, I was made cadet commander of the A Squadron. And I tried to refuse it for a while because I didn't think the Texans would listen to me. And it turned out that it was just the opposite. They led the force for me. So Ryan Field was great in many ways because I went to the University of Arizona, which was in Tucson, and that's where I had flown for, so I knew flying in that kind of condition was pretty normal for me. I had a lot of friends there. So it was a great base. It's still there.
How long were you at Ryan Field?
Each one of the training bases before you were a commissioned officer was 9 weeks. So in 9 weeks I was moved to Marana, which is basic training. And it's a bigger aircraft and more advanced, more maneuverable, higher altitude you can fly with it. And it was pretty close to Tucson, but just in a different direction. And it was in the heart of the cotton district. And Arizona, believe it or not, is a very large producer of cotton, but it's all irrigated. And so we were at Marana Air Base when the temperatures were running 110 and 115 per day. And that's tough by itself, even if the air is dry, but when you got a lot of irrigation going on, it's just as miserable as you couldn't touch the airplane. You'd have to get it up to 10,000 feet before you could close the canopy on it. And Marana had another very, very unique situation for us. In 1937, this we were taught while we were at Marana. 1937, Madame Chiang Kai-shek was able to get a guy by the name of Clarence Chenault to come over and take over the Nationalist Chinese Air Force, which was not much of an air force, and the Japanese were just killing them. And he had been in the United States Army Air Force and had retired as a major. He tried to get pilots from the United States, but the United States would not allow American pilots to go. They couldn't stop them from going, but they took their citizenship away if they went, because we were not at war with Japan at this point. Finally, by 41, the United States, shortly before, rescinded that, and they gave Chenault 100 P-40s without engines, and told him that American pilots could then go to China and fly with the Chinese. General Electric was able to get the engines for him. And so, as you know, that undoubtedly became our most famous air fighting squadron, the Flying Tigers of Chenault. Well, at Marana, by this time in 42, when we're there, we're training. We can now train Chinese pilots in the United States, because we're at war, and we're building up our facilities to the ability to do that. So Marana was half Chinese and half Americans. The only major problem with that was that the Chinese didn't speak English. So when you were flying, the tower was both in Chinese and American, and in English. And so we learned a great deal about how to protect ourselves in the air, because we didn't know that it was real. They also went on to Luke Field again then. Really, really, really well-educated, well-mannered, nice, competitive people. That was a very, very unique experience to go through that kind of training with them. From Marana, if you completed that, everybody that was going to be flying went through basics, primary and basic. And then if you were going to go into bombers, you went to a specific field where they had multi-engine aircraft to do your advanced training. If you were going to go into fighters, single-engine fighters, you went to Luke Field, Phoenix, Arizona. And if you flew the P-38, there was a special base with a twin-engine fighter-type aircraft for them. So everybody wants to be a fighter pilot. It was interesting to me, particularly because I don't know what it is, Hot Shot Charlie or the scarf around the neck or whatever it is. And the girls do like you better and you're treated differently. But so everybody wanted to be a fighter. People have asked me why was I able to be a fighter? And it's interesting, because years ago I found that if I said, well, it's because we were better qualified, I was in real trouble with this, and I didn't like that at all. And so I said that the reason that I got to be a fighter is that they knew I couldn't handle a crew qualified to handle a number of other people in the airplane, and so I had to fly by myself. And that went over very big. The bomber guys felt good about that and so forth, and still do. And it's probably right. But from Marana, I went on to Luke Field, and when that was assigned, we were really, really proud, because we knew that we would be into single-engine fighters, and that's where we wanted to go, unless we washed out at Luke Field.
What type of aircraft did you train in at Luke Field?
We flown in the AT-6 and the P-40. P-40 was our airplane that we had the most of, and that's the first airplane that you were the only person in the airplane. The AT-6 still had a back seat for an instructor, and but it was, you could do almost every maneuver in the AT-6 probably was the airplane that we made the most of in World War II, because the Navy used them as fighter aircraft and with a little modification. So it was a huge production airplane. And you could do instrument flying in that and with the hood on and so forth.
How long were you assigned to that training duty?
9 weeks at Luke Field till I was commissioned. And of that 9 weeks, 2 weeks was at Aho, where you were doing your gunnery training in the airplane. That is, we gunnery trained in everything you can think of. We had skeet fields that we shot at. We had for rifles. We had for pistols, moving targets, all of the stuff that you would want to learn to how to shoot a fighter from a fighter aircraft. Since I was a hunter from the time I was 8 and hunted pheasant and this, that was pretty easy because you learn. It's the same idea, is that concept of leading them. I think Luke Field, other than the P-40, and that is an experience that when I was 7 years old, my father had taken myself and my mother and my 2 older brothers to Casa Grande, Arizona for her health for a year. And we landed, we'd been there about 2 weeks when a very famous lady made an emergency or some type of a landing on a road about 300 yards maybe from our house. Amelia Earhart was on the first cross-country flight of a woman, solo pilot at that time. In the process of that landing and taxiing, she tore her wings, which were in those days were still cloth, and she probably had an airplane of 35 horsepower, 40 horsepower, maybe the most. And we're talking 1928 at this point, Carl. And so my mother gave her a slip, and she cut up and made patches and sewed them onto the airplane. The next day, the airplane was moved to another dirt road where she could take off and refuel. She completed her solo flight, but before she left, she went around and thanked the few people that were there for being there, but she came over and gave me a big hug. And I stood there and watched that lady take off, 7 years old. I still remember it vividly. And that was my introduction to be a fighter pilot and fly, really. So when it came time to fly the P-40, I couldn't wait to get into the airplane. And with all of the preparation for this, and got in it in the morning, and it had maybe an 8 o'clock takeoff time, first time, and that engine sticks out about 8 feet. And it just hypnotized me, almost. I mean, I roared down the runway and just stood there looking at all of this power that I'd moved up from a 600 horsepower engine to almost a 1,400 horsepower. And I just kept going straight out, just staring at that. That was the transition into fighter type aircraft, that you had that tremendous power. And when I took off with that P-40, I thought of Amelia Earhart, and she had taken off in an airplane that had maybe 40 horsepower, flying cross country, and I'm taking off solo in a 12 to 1,400 horsepower engine. It's only 15 years later, or less than 15 years later. That was the big part. Then obviously the graduation ceremony. I did have a wonderful experience. At the end of your training, they had select pilots that went out and tested you. And this was about an hour and a half, depending on what it was. And that was in the AT-6. And And after the hour and a half, this test pilot, all he had done is given me instructions in what to do, and land on one wheel and land on the tail and wheel and, you know, do rolls and all of this stuff. When we got back and got out of the airplane, the rest of the group that were going to be tested was standing there. And the guy said to me, "I just had an airplane ride." And I was walking a foot off the ground. And we got orders that day that we would be going to Tallahassee, Florida. And that meant that we would be probably flying in the European theater. And I was not really fond of the Pacific. I didn't like to swim that much. So,
Where were you stationed after Tallahassee?
Bartow, Florida. And that was a P-51 training base.
What happened after that?
Then the word came that they needed fighter pilots, and this was just before D-Day type thing in Europe then. So the colonel, and I wanted to get married, and the colonel said, well, he said, if you ask for it, he said, I'll give serious consideration to be an instructor in keeping you here on the base. And I did get married, but I said, no, I want to go to combat. That's what I was trained for, and that's what I've always wanted to do, and so forth. So I did get married, and I went through that, and then they took us, another guy and myself, up to New York City, put us at a place called the Chesterfield Hotel, and said, at 8 o'clock each night, call this number, and we'll tell you what to do. And this went 4 or 5 days, and they just said, call again tomorrow night. And finally they said, have your bags down in an hour, we'll pick you up. And they took us out to LaGuardia Field, kept us there for about, I'm saying 2 hours, and finally said, no, we're not going to fly tonight, and whatever the reason was. So they took us back to the Waldorf Astoria, which upgraded us quite a bit from the Chesterfield, I can tell you. And then the next night we did go by, and it was a DC-4, and it was filled with mainly generals and fighter pilots. Landed in Iceland and reprocessed and refurbished the airplane. Then went on to Ireland, and then that was the process. And I went on down to Debden a couple days later and started in
Is this where you joined your squadron?
Debden.
In
Yes.
Debden? And which squadron was that?
Well, it was the 4th Fighter Group, and the 4th Fighter Group was made up of the original Eagle Squadron, and those were pilots that had gone over before we were in the war and flew with the British. And then when we came in the war, they were all transferred to this 4th Fighter Group in Debden, and it was a permanent base. So living conditions were absolutely excellent. Private rooms and batmen to take care of your clothes, and you couldn't live any better.
How long were you stationed there before your first combat mission?
Maybe 4 or 5 days. They did some testing.
Excuse me.
That's all right. We had a couple dogfights with the pilots that were there, and then assigned you an airplane. And so I didn't fly on D-Day, but I flew a couple days after that.
Can you tell me about your first combat mission?
I don't know that this was the first one. It was not too many days after D-Day, maybe a week or 10 days. And we went out on a strafing mission somewhere in front of the troops off of Normandy. And I was flying on the left flank, the lowest guy in the squadron at that time. And coming down a road over here to the left was a car, which appeared to me to be a staff car, and it was probably 2 miles to my left. And 3 or 4 miles down the road, and whoever was leading the squadron said, "Who's ever on the left flank, take that staff car out." It's a German staff car. I peeled off and thought just in terms of taking the staff car out, and went on down and got my guns on, in position. On the P-51, we carried 4 50 caliber machine guns. And when they concentrated those shells going out, it was quite a few per second or minute. And as I pulled the trigger on that to get the staff car, they came to a stop, and 3 guys jumped out. And this large amount of 50 caliber stuff hit them. And I didn't, other than the records, I didn't tell my family about this for 50 years. I couldn't talk about it. I have trouble now a little bit. That's the first time I'd ever killed anybody, and it wasn't a nice looking thing because those shells are heavy enough and they were just dancing in that thing. I froze on the guns, and there was a building right behind them, and I just barely pulled up, and then I threw up in my oxygen mask. That's not a place to throw up that's convenient. And I ripped it off, and I was down at ground level. And then I threw up again and sprayed it all over. Now, you kind of stop for a minute and think about this, and being a sophisticated fighter pilot and to throw up was an embarrassing thing. The killing is different, but you had to take an airplane home for somebody to clean up, and if you did that in training, you had to clean it yourself. I never threw up, and I never had that problem. And so I knew that I was through for the day, and I just asked the commander. I said, "I want to abort and go home," and he said, "Fine." They sent 2 airplanes over much higher than I was to escort me back to England. The experience is not, the crew chiefs that took care of my airplane were much more sophisticated than I was, and they just lifted me out and said, "Don't worry, everything's okay," and I wanted to clean it myself. But they didn't take me to the ready room, which was normal. Well, when I thought about it, they didn't want anybody that looked like I did and smelled like I did in the ready room, no matter what. To hell with that. So they took me to my room. I went and it's all in the book too, by the way, this part. I went and sat with all my flying suit on under the shower, and then cleaned up and got cleaned up and got that mess for it, and then went back to my room. And the chaplain showed up and tried to get me to discuss this with him, and I couldn't do that and didn't want to really at the moment. Finally, I asked the chaplain, and he was sitting on the bunk with me. I said, "Have you ever killed anybody?" And he said, "No." Man, I remember this, Carl, so well. He said, "No, that's not my mission. When you get ready, we'll talk."
What happened after that?
I think that I became a much different personality person because of just thinking about it, and that I think most fighter pilots didn't think about killing anybody. It was shooting airplanes down or tanks or something. And I don't think you never heard about them killing anybody. We didn't go out and kill soldiers, or, that wasn't what our duty was. Our duty was somewhat different than that. So you grow up. If that's what's needed to grow up, it's one way of growing up. I don't have an answer for it. I've asked God a lot of times. It doesn't make sense.
Tell me about some of the other missions that you flew.
One of the most interesting ones that I'd flown, and it was flown just a couple days before I was shot down. The intelligence spotted a convoy of German ships coming around the coast of Norway, and supply ships, and the English wanted to go in with their torpedo bombers and torpedo them, but the English didn't have fighters that could fly that far and escort them into this thing, and so we were selected to go with them. And we flew across the North Sea at about 25 feet above the water for 3 hours to get there. And to fly the North Sea, you knew that if you went down, you had 5 minutes just to survive. It was that bad. And you couldn't, out of fighter aircraft, get in a boat or anything quick enough to stand much chance. So you had to be alert all the time. But anyway, we got in, and then we pulled up to the side, maybe at 4,000 or 5,000 feet, and we could hear obviously the commander of the torpedo group. And they went in, and he'd aim them and tell them what ship they hit with these torpedoes, and they knocked out about 12 or 15 boats, sunk them. It was a spectacular sight. But the flight was we didn't run into any German Luftwaffe at that time, and so we tore for home from that. But that was one of the most interesting to see that take place, and the British were very accurate with their torpedo bombers. And that was then just a few days in. The reason I mention it too was that in the fighter aircraft during the war, rubber was not available. It was very, very thin. And so on our parachutes, the thing that we sat on, they put straw in it. Well, that was for the first day was pretty good, and then it impact and impact and impact, and it became like cement. So when you were sitting there for 3 hours, you just get paralyzed. And now that leads me to another point that's interesting to me. I'm not sure it has any significance other than humor, but obviously we had a relief tube on the P-51, because if you were out for 6 or 7 hours sitting in that thing like this, you would have to relieve yourself. Guys would sometimes want to do it just because they moved and it made them feel better after being paralyzed. The problem with it was that we were flying maybe at 25,000 feet, and the temperature was probably 40 below zero, and we didn't have heaters in the P-51, so we had a flying suit about that thick, and with your oxygen mask and everything on. And then this organ that the human male has that we all talk about, its expansion, but never talk about the fact what it can retreat when it's scared and cold. And it becomes like a turtle, and it just is gone. So, but they made the relief tube on the P-51 at sea level, and without any combat or any of this stuff, and so it was much too short to reach when you needed it. And this was kind of a problem because you needed to tie a string on your penis and to find it, because it had gone away and hidden itself under normal conditions. So, can I go into the most? On the 15th of August, 1944, a convoy of 3,000 ships and escorted by 300 warships was approaching the south coast of France, and they were landing 100,000 troops the first day, 15th of August. They invaded southern France from Italy. okay? And that at 6 in the morning, we were called, and the phone rang in my room, and I kind of slumbered and finally got a hold of it, and the guy said this was so-and-so, and Lieutenant, can you fly? The colonel wants to know if you can fly today. And I thought, that's a ridiculous question. If the colonel wants me to fly, I fly. That's not an issue. And I said, sure, I can fly. What's the problem? He said, I don't know, but be in briefing room at such and such a time. What they had decided was that we were going to escort some B-24s up to Hanover, Germany, and try and draw the Luftwaffe away from southern France so they wouldn't be down there. And that's just common practice to do that. We didn't draw the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe didn't come up that day, as far as I know. And I never had sight of the Luftwaffe, really. Anyway, we went up, did escort them, got out and went up and picked them up at the German border, escorted them in. As soon as we were through with the bomb run, we half of us peeled off, were told to peel off and go down and strafe. Targets of opportunity on our way back to the coast. And so we kind of split off single. And I saw this, I was maybe at 300 feet, saw this engine sticking out of a kind of a little berg, German berg over here. The engine sticking out with steam coming out of it, so I knew it was active. So I went in to make one quick pass, and you couldn't destroy it totally, but you could take it out so it wasn't usable for weeks to repair it. And went in, and just before I had my gun sights on the train and ready to, and I probably had my head where it didn't belong, close to my behind, and all of a sudden I got hit with 50 caliber guns from the ground, and it knocked my engine out and hit me a couple places. The first thing I knew was that I had this pain coming through my leg where a shell had gone through. It peeled off and cranked the canopy back and looked over the side, and I was never in favor of jumping anyway, so it wasn't high enough to jump and open the parachute, and so I had to crash the airplane. And I had seen a little field over there with trees all the way around it that I could probably slip that airplane in, and it would hit on its wing, but you couldn't, control it that way. And then we had a K4 gun sight, which was all mirrors in front of us. And so I slipped it over and started to slip it over the side and knew that I was going to crash, that I wasn't going to be able to survive. And just before I crashed, I threw my arm around that gun sight so my head wouldn't hit all of those glass mirrors and stuff. And I remember that I said it out loud, "It's all yours, Scott." And he did a pretty good job of saving my life. And I've always said he's not a bad co-pilot if you wanted that kind of help. I came to in a field and I can't tell you how much time, it wasn't very much time. So somehow or another, I either got out of that airplane or was thrown out of it. And there was a farmer with a muzzle loading gun, and I opened one eye, and I was laying on the ground, and he was screaming at me, and with his muzzle loading gun in my face. And I closed the eye quickly, and what had happened that I didn't know, the airplane had killed 3 of his cows. And cows were more important than lieutenants in the United States Army Air Force, and he was going to shoot me. And about that time, I heard some kids, 3 farm boys with pitchforks over here, and they got in an argument with the farmer who was going to get me. And I knew if the boys with the pitchforks got me, that it was not going to be fun. And about that time, a voice of a young girl speaking in English said, she wants you to come with her. And I looked up, and here's this little Fraulein, and she said, can you get up? And I thought, boy, you better be able to get up, because this is you got something that's speaking in English to you. And I was finally able to get up. And went over, and the farmer's wife had decided she would take possession of me. Another miracle. And so the farmer's wife and the little girl, one on each side of me, and the farmer's behind, said, we're going to take you over to the house and explain to people to come get me proper. And so I asked the little girl, when we're walking, and she was probably 14. I said, where did you learn English? And she said, oh, all of the Germans have to learn English. And she said, I've had 2 years of speaking English. And I thought, all my training had been in Latin. And I wondered where the hell I could go and speak Latin. What good it was to me. It was the first evidence to me that Hitler had planned on taking the world. He had to speak English and get to England and then to us, type thing. And it really has a lot of bearing on how I evaluate the war now that's going on. And I'm sure you do too. Anyway, they came with finally, she took me into the house, into the kitchen. The farmer went in and made a call someplace. They got me a cup of coffee and a wet, warm towel, and I cleaned my head off, which I was bleeding up here in the eyes, and cleaned this place down here in the shoulder where I got the shell that went through. Then they said, okay, and the German police officers were the ones that came, and they came in a car that was run with coal and wood burner, a big burner on the back, and that would smoke, and that's how they were running that car. Took me to Hanover and put me in a prison. And this was a maximum security prison. Put me in a little cell with barely any light on it, no windows, nothing or anything. And a guy came in and did a body search, which was interesting. And then I went to sleep or passed out. And I woke up maybe 2 or 3 hours. My watch wasn't running. 2 or 3 hours later, and I was in total shock. And that's when I truly became a prisoner of war. There was nobody to call for help, and even God. And I knew that he would help, but I'd have to help myself, because I knew enough about shock that if you got it in the hospital and you were shaken like I was, that you had real troubles. And that's I've always said, that's when I became indoctrinated to be a POW, that you can't change it. I'm not an ex-POW. I'm a POW. It's a wonderful experience to have. But I did, obviously, came out of it.
Did the Gestapo interrogate you while you were there?
They did. One Gestapo agent did later, but not at that time. In the Hanover, they just were making sure I was a prisoner, and they getting ready to turn me over to the Luftwaffe, and they didn't do any interviewing at all there in Hanover. In fact, two guys came in the next morning sometime, or afternoon, and said, we're taking you to Frankfurt now. And two Germans, and then only one of them got on the train with me. This was like 4 in the afternoon or 5 o'clock, and there was a lot of people in the streets. This was shortly after, sometime after the Great Escape had taken place. The citizens had been notified by Hitler that we were all fair target, and that